of the Created Equal America's Civil Rights Program Series. Created Equal is made possible through a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of its Bridging Cultures initiative in partnership with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. Created Equal brings together 4 powerful documentaries to encourage communities across the nation to reflect and discuss our shared civil rights history. The 4 films span the period from the 1830s to the 1960s and are the centerpiece for this project. The library is honored to be one of 470 communities around the nation to host Created Equal. The mission of the Independence Public Library is to provide quality materials and services which fulfill educational, informational, cultural, and recreational needs of the entire community in an atmosphere that is welcoming, respectful, and businesslike. With Created Equal, its concepts and goals align perfect with our mission at the Independence Public Library. The library, with the funding of the Created Equal grant, is providing programming that is scholarly, functional, and provides an opportunity for lifelong learners. The programming in the series is a catalyst to discuss and learn from our shared histories and allow us to reflect on issues that face our community as a whole. The library has taken the time and effort to provide programming that not only aligns with our mission and goals, but aligns with the Created Equal initiative and community interests. Programs in the series include 4 film discussions, teen and adult book discussions, a John Brown presentation by Grady Atwater, site administrator for the John Brown Museum, a viewing of 8 the Play with a discussion led by KU Law students Anita Chappé and Jack McMillan, a workshop by the Kansas Human Rights Commission about diversity in the workplace, a civil rights panel discussion, and children's story times. Throughout the entire program series, please keep in mind the following guidelines. Commit to learning, not debating. Listen respectfully and allow others to speak without interruption. Respect one another's views. Avoid blame, speculation, and inflammatory language. Consider the effects of what you are saying may have on other people. No personal attacks, and respect the group's time. The kickoff tonight features Ken Brown, a local historian. He will be discussing the history of race relations and independence. Following Mr. Brown's presentation, there will be a refreshment served on the 2nd floor with wine sponsored by Mikey's Liquor. You can view our informative life-size timeline chronicling local and national events in the civil rights movement. Have you ever wondered how independent civil rights history compares to the nation's? You might be surprised at what you find. Please join us as we begin our conversation of our shared civil rights history and welcome Ken Brown to the podium.
Thank you, and I'm going to guess a number of you came for the refreshments, but you have to suffer through me first. And nearly 50 years ago, I drove my nearly new 1963 Volvo into Independence with everything I owned in that little car. Never taught a day in my life, didn't know a soul in Independence, didn't know a thing about Independence. So bluntly, I was just a snot-nosed kid right out of graduate school. And I was hired to teach, but as it turns out, teaching was a learning experience for me. And I was very anxious to teach my first American government class because I wanted to teach my students about the theory of judicial self-restraint in the legal process, since that was actually one of the favorite subjects that I'd ever studied. And so I gave what I thought was probably the greatest lecture ever given on judicial self-restraint. And my students actually looked puzzled more than amazed. And I realized at that time that I'd forgotten to define the Supreme Court and tell them how it functioned. So it was kind of meaningless for me to expound on the theory of judicial self-restraint. And I think the same might be appropriate here tonight. So before I give my brilliant lecture on civil rights and independence, we should define civil rights. So who would like to do that? Oh, and he said don't interrupt the speaker. Well, you're not interrupting. This is part of our class participation here. But when you think of civil rights, anybody, what do you What would you expect me to talk about tonight?
I think of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
The Bill of Rights, and yeah, that's right. So free speech, religion, press, assembly, broader topics, the right of privacy, habeas corpus, eminent domain, all of those. And so, is that what you'd like to hear tonight? Me to discuss the Bill of Rights? Probably not. No, I didn't think so. And that's good because I did not bring those notes. So so we have those rights. So what does civil rights then mean?
Well, we're generally talking about the ability to practice those rights for, and when we talk about civil rights, we're normally talking about minority groups that sometimes have to battle for the right to those things that we tend to take for granted.
And that, once again, is the correct answer, and that's sort of what I have here. So it's not to discriminate on any of those rights because of race, gender, religion, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, and there, in fact, a lot of companies now have the little thing at the bottom that they do not discriminate based on all of those. And then likewise, it's that those cannot be used to discriminate by either the government, by social organizations, or by private individuals. So, that being the case, and Chuck mentioned minorities, as a white male discussing civil rights, I often feel the need to apologize to many groups and think, what were we thinking? I'm speaking now for the white men. And when you say, what were we thinking, it sort of implies that, but we don't think that way anymore, which is actually not the case. It's not that people suffered through a period of prejudice and then we got over it, because there's still a lot of discrimination by a lot of different people. Last night's paper talked about a congressman in Texas who equated Obama with Hitler. You don't have to have a long memory to think of the names of Rodney King, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and so those kind of things continue today. And there is plenty of prejudice, and not just by white men, but by lots of people against immigrants. 28 states, including Kansas, have passed English-only statutes. You know, we used to have, back in the old days, whites-only drinking fountains, and now we have English-only documents. Discrimination against the mentally ill, gays and lesbians, and others. And when I used to teach a lot of judicial process, one of my favorite judges was William O. Douglas. We talked about the discrimination against what he called the poor, the ugly, and the despised in our society. And they're usually pretty easy to pick on because they're pretty defenseless. Well, obviously, we cannot discuss all prejudice against all people in the United States, in Kansas, or even here in Independence in 20 minutes. But I would like to touch on a number of overt discriminations in our history. So if we look in the little timeline I've cheated, I did see it, it's very good. But if we look at gender discrimination, when Kansas became a state in 1861, we did allow women the right to vote in school elections. Nothing more important than that. Women were allowed to vote in municipal elections in 1887. And it wasn't until 1912 that women were given the full suffrage to vote, which is, incidentally, 8 years before they were given the right to vote nationwide. And Kansas was the fourth state to ratify that amendment. There was another Equal Rights Amendment posed in 1972, which simply said equality of rights under the law should not be denied on account of sex. and there weren't even enough states to ratify that. It fell 3 short. And we might think that, well, gender discrimination is over. But if you look at the current figures, a woman today makes 77 cents for her work compared to $1 paid to a man. And it's even, that gap is even wider if you look at minority women. But usually when we talk of civil rights, we think of race relations. And so if we start that, 1869, when independence was founded by George Brown, who is no relation to me, but he promised that there would be peace between the races. And he was talking about the white settlers and the Osage Indians, was the race relations. And in his agreement, he paid $50 for the area that we have. And he also agreed that the Indians were allowed to keep their ponies on our land because we bought it, and that we would pay $5 tax for every house that we built. Yeah, I got my tax bill the other day. I think they've raised that. So, according to most sources, the first permanent non-Indian settler in Montgomery County was Lewis Scott, who was a Negro, and I find that an awkward term to say, but that's in the old records. That's what it is. And in the 1870 census, so this would be a year after independence was founded, there were 435 people living in Independence, and only one was a Negro. Between March 1871 and 1875, the South Kansas Tribune, which was a little weekly newspaper that has great microfilm that I read all the time, does not mention any problems between the blacks and the whites in this entire county. In the 1880 census, Independence boasted a population of nearly 3,000, and there were 200 who were Negroes, almost 7%. And many listed in the census the same household as white people, indicating that there was a very good relationship between the blacks and the whites. And the Tribune did note caution in April of 1879. They said the exodus, and they were in fact called exodusters, of the Negroes from the South continues at an alarming extent, but we do not need their labor, nor do we wish to rob the South of their labors. Pretty much saying, okay, don't come anymore. Independence built its first school, the Fourth Ward School, and I made a few maps. I'll keep going. I know I learned in teaching that you don't want to get too much material out. I'm pass those around. Don't want to pass out too much material because people will be reading that instead of listening. But on that little map, the Fourth Ward School is down in the bottom right-hand corner, the fourth W down there. And so that school was built in 1872. And the second school built was the Second Ward School, and that's in the upper left-hand corner, where Lincoln School was later located. And before the fall term of 1880, the Independence Board of Education voted that all black children would go to one room in the Fourth Ward School, and they would only be taught one subject, and that was reading. Well, the Tribune, and so at the beginning of the school year in 1880, the Tribune noted, the colored school didn't open well. Although the room is well furnished and an old teacher provided, not a pupil appeared on Monday. This is to be regretted. It will not do for colored pupils to deny themselves school privileges simply because they cannot have equal opportunities and incentives with the other children. The Tribune continued by saying, we are opposed to the colored school on principle, but if the people have to pay for one, we are in favor of the board filling it by force if necessary. And so this action to segregate the schools was challenged in the court. And of all the, well, actually, this is one of the most amazing things I've ever read in Independence history. And it did go to our local courts and ended up in the Kansas Supreme Court in 1891. And that decision is Jordan Knox, who was the father of two little black children, Bertha and Lily, petitioned the Board of Education in the fall of 1887 to employ Mr. E.M. Wood, who was a colored man, to teach the grades in that room in the Fourth Ward School building, and that the petition was granted by the board. So the board did agree to hire this Mr. Wood to teach in that room. Then Mr. Knox, the father of the two children, informed the board that he desired his children to go to the Second Ward School building. Didn't want them just in the one room in the Fourth Ward. So the Kansas Supreme Court decision, which is Bertha Knox versus the Board of Education, the City of Independence, gave these facts. They said there were 4 school buildings, and I put the rest of them on there, that had both black and white students in, and there were black and white students in all wards. The plaintiffs, Bertha and Lily Knox, were colored children, 10 and 8, and they reside 130 yards from the Second Ward School, so the one up by Lincoln. But were required by the Board of Education to attend the Fourth Ward School, which was 16 blocks from their home, as were all colored children in Independence. And likewise, no white children from the Second Ward were asked to attend the Fourth Ward School. So it wasn't like busing, where we'll send some there, some here, and for racial balance. And the court unanimously ruled, this is 1891, the legislature of this state has not given to the Board of Education the power to establish separate schools for the education of white children and colored children, and to exclude from the schools established for white all colored children for no other reason than they are colored. If the board has the power because of race to establish separate schools for children of African descent, then the board has the power to establish separate schools for persons of Irish descent, German descent, then red-headed children, and then blondes. And we do not think that the board has such power. And the reason that is so amazing was this was 5 years before the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that allowed school districts to have separate but equal facilities. And the standard in Plessy then was to determine whether schools were equal because they allowed them to be separate. And that measure, of course, if you've read any part of history, they were never equal. And that standard was kept until Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, and Earl Warren, writing for the majority and again in a unanimous decision, stated that the main question to settle was not whether facilities are equal, but whether children could be separated simply on the basis of skin color, which is the exact same question answered by the Kansas Supreme Court in 1891. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that they could not. And the bottom line is that was the last time that schools in Independence were segregated. So, moving along, World War I changed our society a great deal, and that too is kind of beyond the scope of our little talk tonight. But the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the hostilities of World War I, did blame Germany for everything, which of course led to Hitler, and it also gave us a great mistrust of foreigners. And as a result of our mistrust of foreigners, the United States turned towards isolationism, which actually encouraged Hitler, and we put our faith in 100% Americans. And the reason I point this out, there were unknown parties in 1918 who smeared red and yellow paint all over the German Lutheran school. And they warned the German Lutheran school, as it was called, to discontinue all use of the German language And actually, I've got both postcards of the German Lutheran school, the German Lutheran church, and they did change their name, during World War I. And these unknown parties also indicated that they had knocked German, the use of German, out of the county high school. There was similar vandalism on Geckler's shoe store in downtown, where they painted red and yellow on his storefront, indicating once again that discrimination and prejudice is not just a black-white thing. There are many times that people of all shapes and sizes have picked on people that were not like they were. And there was a lot of hatred at this period of time around the 1920s against foreigners, against Catholics, against Jews, against communists. And that actually led to the KKK flourishing. It is somewhat ironic that the Klan's original objectives, and the quote was to protect the weak, the innocent, the defenseless from the indignities, the wrongs, and the outrages of the lawless, the violent, and the brutal. So that was their mission, but they became a hate group, advancing white supremacy, endorsed violence against non-whites. And of course, we had quite a KKK following here in Independence, and they met some at Memorial Hall, they met some at the ballpark. They had a building downtown where they had their meetings. We also had a race riot in December of 1920. A white grocer by the name of Reed Walton was shot and killed, and he was identified. Noble Green was identified as a black man who was leaving the scene, and he was taken into custody. A mob of about 1,000 well-armed white men assembled at City Hall, and their intent was to lynch this Noble Green. Black men also came in support of Green, but they realized the imminent danger that was about to happen, and all but 8 of them left. And then there are differing accounts as to what happened next, but gunshots started ringing out, and a black man named Arthur Harper was riddled by bullets, and a young white man, James Clennon, was also shot and killed. Well, the National Guard from Lawrence came down and whisked Green away. He was later convicted and served 27 years in prison. And some of the events that you can read after this 1920 are triggered by that. It is very fortunate for Independence that our city officials were very much opposed to the Klan. And the largest Klan grouping in Montgomery County was in Coffeyville, including their police chief. But there was the largest rally out by Wingert Farm, which is a couple miles south of Independence. It's estimated that as many as 4,200 people attended that rally. But our city officials, as I mentioned, were opposed to the Klan. Mayor John Wadman prohibited the Klan from meeting in the city in 1922. Mayor I.G. Fowler had the city commission pass an ordinance prohibiting anyone to make public speeches or participates in demonstrations while wearing a mask. And Mayor Charlie Kerr denied the use of the ballpark for the Klan in 1925. The Klan also endorsed particular candidates for public office, and Lou Ernest was the Klan-backed candidate for mayor in 1924. And Ernest, in defending why he was a Klan member, said, "I wish to say in regard to the colored race, the Klan are not against you, but have you ever stopped to consider your rights? Look at the foreigners taking your place in the public work. Can you get the same job that you did a few years ago? No, you cannot. We are fighting for your rights as well as American-born whites." And he said that we must turn back the tide of immigration that threatens to overthrow American civilization. And we hear some of those same sentiments today. Who does? No. Well, Mr. Mosley has a great little book that I brought. If some of you haven't seen, I'll share with you about the development of black businesses and the effect of segregation and independence. And he notes that Chuck told me that he was leaving. He's not offended by anything I said. He has to go to the city commission meeting. Good luck, Chuck. But there were successful builders and carpenters established in the 20s and 30s. I know as a tennis coach, the tennis courts were segregated until the early 50s. There were the courts where we have now, and then there were colored courts about where the miniature golf course is now. The garden house, which is now the park office, was the colored showers. The clubhouse was that we have now is the white showers. There was a colored pool and a waiting pool. Colored people had to sit in the balcony in the theaters. They could work at the Booth Hotel, but they couldn't be guests there. And there were a lot of these sometimes subtle and sometimes just blatant examples of discrimination. I've looked at all the old high school yearbooks. Black students were always pictured last amongst seniors until the 1940 annual. There was a separate basketball team called the Wildcats, a separate pep club, separate basketball queen, Anita Bradley, which I think is Faye's sister. Paul Harper's book also talks about the athletic teams being segregated, and his quote was, "Unless the Negro was particularly good in a sport, like Major McBee, who was a student at Montgomery County High School, Independence High School, and he took 4 first in the Verticus Valley League track meet in 1920. There for a while, we were a member of the Verticus League and the SEK. And that was in 1918 when track was integrated, but that was the only sport there was. And World War II obviously changed the lives of everyone. 60 million people were killed. Roughly 2/3 of them were civilians. 7 million Jews were exterminated in the gas ovens by the Nazis simply because they were Jewish. 17 million Americans served in the military. Any able-bodied man, 35 or under, was either enlisted or drafted, including many very famous people, professional athletes, movie stars, all 4 of Franklin Roosevelt's sons. And minorities were drafted at the same ratio as whites, and they were paid the same. But the Marines excluded blacks from serving, the Navy used them as servants, and the Army created separate black regiments commanded mostly by white officers. We had a local air base here in Independence that trained nearly 5,000 soldiers between 1943 and 1945. And if you look at their little yearbook, there were the 323 squadron, had about 190 soldiers in it, and they were all black, and they were all pictured at the back of the Independence Army Flying School yearbook. And it does almost seem hypocritical that our government is using minority soldiers to fight against the Nazis because they were spouting the superiority of the Aryan race, but yet many of the blacks were kept as second-class citizens here at home. Another example of discrimination during the war, on the West Coast, 120,000 American Japanese were put in relocation camps simply because they were Japanese and kept for the remainder of the war. And our justification was it was for their own protection, but deep down, many in high authority were suspicious that the Japanese might try to sabotage, even though they were 2/3 of them were American-born citizens, the United States. Well, things seemed to get a little bit better after World War II. Adam Clayton Powell was elected to the House of Representatives, served 11 terms. Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball. Harry Truman desegregated the military by executive order in 1948. Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. At our local high school, basketball was integrated in 1950. Football was integrated in 1953. The 1956 yearbook pictures Montgomery County All-Star quarterback number 32, Faye Bradley. In 1961, Betty Williams was the first black football queen candidate. Linda Anderson was elected in 1962 as the first black class officer. She was president of the junior class. 1966, James Pack escorted Sandra Greenwood in the basketball queen coronation. And I remember when I came to Independence in 1966, it was kind of an unwritten rule that there would be one token white boy on the basketball floor at all times. I also remember a controversy at the high school. I was at the college, but a controversy when some white students argued that if black kids were allowed to wear Malcolm X t-shirts, that they should be allowed to wear Ku Klux Klan costumes. Well, the school administration, of course, did not buy that. And it's that all of that slow integration is the beginning of the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. And of course, the Brown versus Board of Education speak in 1954 is the mainstay to that, because even though that decision dealt with schools, then they used that principle and applied it to other public facilities. This is also the beginning of Dr. Martin Luther King, is today is his real birthday, isn't it? January 15th. And how he organized citizens in Montgomery, Alabama, staged a bus boycott when commuter Rosa Parks was jailed, refusing to give up her seat to a white person. A year later, President Eisenhower ordered 1,000 troops to desegregate the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. There was a CBS documentary about this time called The Hate That Hate Produced, which gave the National of Islam and Malcolm X his national exposure. Kennedy was elected in 1960, pushed for affirmative action programs in an attempt to right the injustices of past discrimination. There was also plenty of bloodshed, and all of those are kind of peaceful. There was also plenty of bloodshed in the 1960s, the assassination of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, of Martin Luther King, the bombing of a church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls, the riot in Watts in Detroit. There were some militant groups, the Black Panthers, founded by Stokely Carmichael and Huey Newton, who encouraged some violence. There were also, there's plenty of other bloodshed, the assassinations of John and Bobby Kennedy, students being shot on college campuses at Kent State and Jackson State, atrocities in Vietnam and My Lai, and napalming of Vietnamese people. In fact, when you look at the 60s, you think, wow, how did we make it through that period of time? Well, on the plus side, the federal government was pushing for far greater civil rights. Eisenhower in Little Rock, Kennedy with James Meredith in Mississippi, Johnson getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, which outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But once again, just because you have words doesn't mean that you're going to have actions that follow. We have all these things even in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution about all men are created equal. The 24th Amendment was passed in 1964 to eliminate the poll tax. And the poll tax was another attempt by southern states to discourage at least poor and black people from voting. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which outlawed the literacy test, which was another example of discriminating against blacks, asking them, they would have 2 literacy tests in most precincts, and when you walked in, they looked at you if they liked what you looked like. You were given a literacy test which said, write your name. You'd write your name, that's good enough. Literacy means you can read and write. If they didn't like the way you looked, if you were black, if you were Hispanic, you got a literacy test which said, name leading Supreme Court decisions interpreting the 14th Amendment. Well, start naming those. I'm sorry, you can't vote. And so the 24th Amendment the Voting Rights Act outlawed the literacy test. It also sent federal registers to assist all sorts of people in the South and the Southwest in particular, the Indians and Hispanics in registering to vote. Well, Kansas never had a literacy test. We've never had a poll tax. We've never had a white primary or any of those other tricks used by many states. Some argue that today there's as much discrimination against brown people as there is black people. And I mentioned earlier the English-only attitudes. Some say the voter ID law is the equivalent of a poll tax because people are having to go buy their birth certificate to show that they are legitimate citizens. Our legislature in the last session, I don't think it passed, but they wanted students to have to prove their citizenship with either a Social Security card or a birth certificate. A few years back, California narrowly defeated an initiative which would deny health care to the legal immigrants. But I'm not suggesting at all that discrimination against blacks have gone away. If you've paid any attention to news in the last 6 months, obviously it is not. And I think it's, there are many people that hate Obama primarily because he's black, even though they won't admit that. But the other things they associate with Obama and being Muslim, as not being a citizen, I think are perpetuated somewhat by his race. And after I wrote this, I thought, this sounds sort of bad and sort of sad, and what can we do about it? Well, I think that we, and I mean all people, need to think of that documentary, the hate that hate produced. And we just need to quit hating people. And if you watch the news today, I mean, it's in was it Belgium? Where, I mean, people just seem to want to take a very aggressive stance and shoot people that disagree with it. And so to quit the hate, it means that we have to quit hating black people, brown people, immigrants, whether they're legal or not, Muslims, gays, lesbians, people who simply disagree with us or are different than we are. And I think also that it's important that we spend as much time finding solutions as we do defining the problems. I think it's good to hear the history of this, but so we've spent way more than I intended defining the problem. Can we spend this much time finding solutions? And I think that programs like this, and last year we had the Courageous Conversations, and I see some of the same faces, are moving in that direction. Because when you look at our history, we can't make it any better than it was. But we can make today better, and we can make tomorrow better. So, back to you. Or do you have questions, or ready for your refreshments?
What was the first ward school? Was that built especially for the blacks?
No, that was just
That was already
the
there.
first school.
And it was already an existing building?
Yes. It was built in 1872 as the first school And so all the kids would have gone to that school. And then 8 years later was when they tried to make it, all the black kids had to go to that. And all in one room. And you know, I went to a country school, and it was a 2-room schoolhouse. We had a big room and a little room. But they don't teach that way anymore. And even back here, you would have had people divided by grade. You know, so you might have the first 2 grades and the next, and you know, you might change it from one year to the next on the number of pupils. But in 1880 was when they said all the black kids are going to go to that one room before.
How long were they expected to go? You said they were just going to learn to read.
Yep.
Were they attending 1 year, several years?
That I don't know. I think they just intended as long as you went to school, you were going to go to that. Yeah. Now, my dad grew up in the sticks of Arkansas, and he said that, and I think he finished the 5th grade. He said that in Arkansas, you went to school until you were old enough to start picking cotton, and you picked cotton until you were old enough to run away from home. And so he said he picked cotton starting about the 5th grade and ran away from home when he was 16, came up to the oil fields of Kansas. Yeah, we have a lot more stringent laws. We could turn to our Board of Education today about what you must do, you know, to satisfy requirements and what constitutes a student and all of those things. But it was much more lax back in the old days. I'm glad you asked a question I knew the answer to. Sometimes I don't know. All right, well, thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Brown for coming out tonight and giving the presentation. I'd like to invite everybody to the 2nd floor. In the Kansas room, we have refreshments as well as a large timeline. It's about 9 feet, chronicling local and national civil rights movements here. So if you want to go to the 2nd floor, and you can hand in your evaluations to any of the library staff. And thank you for coming.